He didn't press the wrong button. He didn't miscalculate. He did not stumble over his own ambition. He knew exactly what he was doing. In 1929, while millions of Americans lost their homes, jobs, and dignity, one man emerged unscathed, rich, elegant, and with his reputation almost intact. The collapse destroyed entire families, but he simply changed his address. This is the banker who helped trigger the worst financial crisis of the 20th century, the same one that devastated the global market, brought down banks, froze economies, and reshaped the modern world. And even thus, he was never arrested. He was never convicted. He never returned a single cent. While newspapers screamed panic, while Wall Street burned, while investors jumped out of windows, he dined with politicians, quietly negotiated with prosecutors, and repositioned his fortune with the coldness of someone who knew the inner workings of the system long before everyone else. And here's the most unsettling detail: he didn't break any laws, because the laws were written to protect you. The story you are about to see is not just a chapter of the Great Depression, it's a brutal reminder of how power really works, how crises don't happen by accident, and how certain men navigate chaos as if they were immune to the rules that govern the rest of the world. Get ready! This is not the story of the 1929 crash. It's the story of the man who fell standing and helped build the modern financial system in his own image. Before the 1929 crash, Charles Mitchell's power could already be felt in every corridor of Wall Street. He didn't need to make grand speeches or appear on newspaper covers. A single decision from him was enough to move billions in stocks. Investors watched his every move as if observing divine signs, and banks copied his strategies with the obedience of disciples. Mitchell wasn't just the president of National City Bank, he was the man who dictated the rhythm of the market, like a conductor controlling an orchestra about to go into a frenzy. Back then, Americans lived under the illusion that prosperity had no limits. The stock market soared like a rocket, and the whole country believed that the future could only get better. And it was Mitchell who fueled that belief. He democratized investing by offering cheap credit and easy access to stocks, a tempting invitation for ordinary people to bet what they didn't have on a market that seemed invincible. The country treated him like a visionary. He treated the country like fuel. But what few knew was that this democratization had a sinister side. Each share bought with borrowed money increased the weight of a house of cards that Mitchell helped build every day. While the public celebrated quick profits, he attentively observed what no one else saw: the structure was rotten inside. And when the first pillar began to crumble, the entire American economy would feel the impact, except, of course, Mitchell himself, who was already preparing his silent exit. And it is at this point that our story begins to take shape. Because to understand the magnitude of the damage he would cause, we need to understand who was the man behind the greatest speculative euphoria in United States history. Charles Mitchell wasn't born powerful, he made it. Coming from a humble background, he understood early on that the financial world doesn't reward those who wait, but those who move forward. Ambitious, charismatic, and almost mesmerizing in his ability to persuade, Mitchell quickly gained a foothold in New York's elite. He possessed something few bankers have: presence. When he spoke, investors stopped. When he took the helm of National City Bank, no one doubted that a new era was beginning, but no one imagined the price the country would pay for it. Mitchell's secret was simple: he understood the human appetite for quick wealth like no one else. While competitors followed conservative models, Mitchell bet on aggressive expansion. He transformed National City Bank into a credit distribution machine, encouraging Americans of all classes to enter the stock market even without real money to do so. His motto seemed to be, "If you wish, we can finance it," and this strategy transformed him into the architect of the biggest speculative frenzy of the decade. But there was something deeper to his rise. Mitchell didn't see the market as a natural environment, but as a chessboard to be manipulated. He believed he could control the behavior of the masses and shape the economy according to his own vision. And, while the country celebrated his financial genius, few realized they were witnessing someone willing to push every possible limit to achieve absolute power. And to understand how far this would go, we need to look at how he lit the fuse of the biggest speculative bubble in American history. Mitchell realized something that almost no one else had noticed: Americans were experiencing an unprecedented moment of optimism. Cars, electricity, buildings, skyscrapers, everything gave the feeling that wealth was within anyone's reach. And he decided to transform this enthusiasm into fuel for the market. Under his leadership, National City Bank began offering easy loans with low interest rates and little vetting, and then encouraged customers to use that money to buy stocks. It was the famous buy now, worry later, and when the middle class first entered the stock market, the volume of capital exploded. Mitchell also had another ace up his sleeve. He transformed his own bank into an aggressive stock market salesman. He created entire departments dedicated to pushing stocks on investors without explaining the real risks. It was financial marketing before the term even existed. Pamphlets, consultants, elegant meetings, and luxurious offices, all carefully designed to make the average investor believe that the stock market was a direct elevator to wealth. And the more people bought, the higher the prices rose, and the more Mitchell seemed like a visionary. But behind this brilliant rise, there was a crucial detail: almost all the appreciation came from credit. People buying stocks with money they didn't have. Banks lending without collateral. Brokerages offering exorbitant margins. It was an emotional pyramid scheme, a collective trust building a mountain of silent risk. And Mitchell knew this. He saw numbers that didn't add up daily: fragile balance sheets, growing debt. But instead of slowing down, he accelerated. After all, while the music played, he was the conductor. And the most dangerous thing is that Mitchell began to believe in his own myth. He thought he could control the market, stop falls, adjust expectations, manipulate rumors. He imagined he could prevent any correction, as if the financial universe obeyed his will. But markets don't obey men obeying mathematics, psychology, and, above all, the weight of accumulated decisions. And with millions of people leveraged up to their necks, all Mitchell did was build a national time bomb, and the clock was already ticking down the last seconds. While the public viewed Mitchell as a national hero, the banker who democratized the stock market, behind the scenes he relied on a network of power that made his decisions virtually untouchable. Politicians, industrialists, transportation magnates, and even members of the Federal Reserve orbited his influence. He financed campaigns, backed projects, and offered generous credit to strategic figures. In return, he received silence, loyalty, and open doors. It was an ecosystem where each favor reinforced his authority, creating a protective web that allowed him to take ever greater risks without fearing immediate consequences. National City Bank didn't operate alone. It used subsidiaries, shell companies, and financial associations to create a network of artificial liquidity. While ordinary Americans believed the market was growing on merit, this secretive machine pushed capital into the stock market to keep the euphoria alive. It was as if Mitchell had built an entire theater, with perfect sets and bright lights, but with rotten structures supporting the stage. Within this system, crashes were masked, losses were shifted, and rumors were stifled before they gained traction. The problem is that this mechanism began to creak. Experienced investors saw strange signs: unprofitable companies being valued like giants, banks lending excessively, indebted families buying stocks as if they were grocery bills. Some members of the Federal Reserve warned about the credit bubble, but their voices were largely ignored because Mitchell was pushing for no change. Any attempt to curb speculation was treated as an attack on American progress. The myth of infinite growth was more convenient than reality. It was at this point that the implosion began, silent and inevitable. The system that protected Mitchell could no longer bear the weight of its own lies. Small drops became headlines. Rumors of default began to circulate. Smaller banks felt the squeeze and turned off the tap of credit. It was like pulling a loose thread on a giant carpet. Once moved, everything began to unravel. And Mitchell, who had always believed he controlled the market, began to realize, albeit too late, that the tide was turning and that he could no longer stop it. When the market finally gave way, it wasn't a single event, but a sequence of shocks, each more violent than the last. Prices began to plummet slowly, as if the market were whispering a warning no one wanted to hear. But when the fall accelerated, it turned into panic. The brokerage's phone wouldn't stop ringing, newspapers rushed to update headlines, and entire families, who believed they had achieved the American dream, saw their savings evaporate in a matter of hours. Euphoria turned to fear. Fear turned to despair. And Mitchell was at the center of this storm. The irony is that he himself tried to prevent the collapse, but his final gesture only proved the magnitude of the illusion. On the day known as Black Thursday, Mitchell gathered bankers, hastily raised capital, and ordered massive purchases to try to stabilize the market. The scene looked like something out of a movie, men in suits, running between desks, betting millions to save a system that was already dead inside. For a few minutes, it worked. The market breathed. But it was just a gasp before drowning. Deep down, no one could sustain inflated prices for so long. Confidence had already broken, and confidence, on Wall Street, is everything. Over the following days, the scenario became apocalyptic. Stocks plummeted by more than 80%. Banks failed en masse. Companies closed their doors. And millions of Americans, who had been encouraged to invest with easy credit and exaggerated promises, found themselves jobless, without savings, and without prospects. The crash was not just a financial event, it was an emotional, social, and psychological collapse. And every report from the time pointed to the same structural flaw, the rampant speculation fueled by Mitchell. The most tragic thing is that, while the ruin spread, many still believed Mitchell would find a way out. He always did. He always convinced. He always promised. But this time it was different. The bubble he helped inflate was too big, too fragile, too exposed. The final fall was not only inevitable, it was deserved. And it is at this point that the story changes tone, because now we are not talking about the market, but about the personal downfall of the man who believed he controlled the destiny of Wall Street. When the dust finally settled after the crash, one thing became clear: while the entire Wall Street crumbled, Charles Mitchell had nowhere left to run. The man who for years had been treated as a financial celebrity, received as a hero at gala dinners, and listened to as if he were a prophet, now walked through empty bank corridors, shunned by his own allies. The press, which had previously exalted him, began to treat him as the architect of the disaster. And Mitchell, for the first time in his life, realized that influence doesn't protect you when the whole world starts looking for someone to blame. The government, pressured by millions of ruined Americans, needed to put a face to the failure, and the spotlight fell directly on Mitchell. Investigations began, documents were scrutinized, and every decision he made was now interpreted as recklessness, ego, or manipulation. The man who once symbolized American prosperity was slowly being stripped of his iconic image. And the most ironic thing? Mitchell knew the system well. He knew where the flaws were. He knew the collapse was a collective effort, but, as happens in every great financial tragedy, someone had to foot the bill. And the most relentless accuser was the very public that once idolized him. Even so, Mitchell tried everything to stay afloat. He sold personal belongings, renegotiated debts, and used his network of contacts. He believed that, as always, he could overcome the crisis with charm and influence. But now that was no longer enough. The Great Depression had destroyed not only fortunes, but the illusion that bankers were untouchable. And, while millions faced soup lines and evictions, any gesture of self-defense sounded like arrogance. The final blow came when he had to resign as chairman of National City Bank. The most powerful man on Wall Street walked out of the building he had commanded for years, and no one followed. There was no grand farewell. No applause. Just silence. Mitchell was no longer in control. He would become the symbol of the downfall. And it is precisely at this moment, when a personal empire crumbles, that a new question arose: how far would justice really go, and how far could he get away with it? When Charles Mitchell was finally brought to court, the atmosphere felt less like a judicial process and more like a national spectacle. The lines outside the courthouse resembled movie premieres, but this time the film was about the ruin of the country. Newspapers splashed his picture daily, headlines called him the banker who betrayed America, and commentators demanded exemplary punishment. It was as if the entire country expected to see Mitchell in handcuffs, paying for the suffering of millions. And, at that moment, it seemed inevitable: he would be publicly destroyed. The prosecutors presented all the market manipulation, conflicts of interest, disguised loans, and stock sales before the collapse. To the public, this was more than evidence, it was confirmation that the financial elite had always played with rigged cards. Mitchell listened to each accusation with a rigid face, but inside he knew that something deeper was at stake. It wasn't about proving guilt or innocence, but about deciding whether the United States would sacrifice a single banker to absolve an entire system. And then came the unexpected twist. Just when he seemed poised for conviction, the defense presented the argument that would change everything. Technically, nothing Mitchell had done clearly violated the laws of the time. Were they unethical practices? Yes. Morally questionable? Certainly. But illegal? Not on paper. And this detail opened a loophole that transformed the case. After months of trial, Mitchell was acquitted. The newspapers were shocked. The public was furious. And Wall Street sighed with relief. But the acquittal was not a victory, it was an emotional sentence. Mitchell left the courtroom free, but ruined. His reputation would never recover. He lost influence, he lost fortune, he lost status. He was a free man, yes, but condemned to irrelevance. And it is here that the story changes once again, paving the way for the final topic, the silent legacy of this acquittal and how it shaped the laws, the financial system, and the way crises would be handled forever. The acquittal of Charles Mitchell was not just the end of a trial, it was the beginning of a profound transformation in the American financial system. When a judge declared that Mitchell had broken no laws, the country realized an uncomfortable truth. The problem wasn't just the banker, the problem was the system that allowed a banker to bring down the economy without violating any rules. And this feeling of collective powerlessness led the government to do something it had never done before: redesign the U.S. financial structure practically from scratch. It was in this climate of indignation that historical landmarks such as the were born. Glass-Steagall Act, the creation of the SEC, and a new era of oversight that would change Wall Street forever. But here's the ironic and almost poetic point of the story: Mitchell, the man who escaped punishment, unwittingly became the template for the laws that would limit the power of future Mitchells. In other words, he became the example the government needed. Not because he was punished, but because he proved the size of the loophole in the legislation. The destruction was so profound that the American government finally realized it could no longer allow Wall Street to operate like a financial Wild West. The 1929 crisis exposed such blatant manipulations, like those carried out by that same banker, that a new entity had to be created. Thus, in 1934, the SEC was born, the Securities and Exchange Commission. An agency created not to punish the past, but to prevent the future from being dominated by the same men who played with the market as if it were their own private chessboard. The SEC was structured to oversee, demand transparency, curb fraud, and, for the first time, impose rules on a system that until then operated in the dark. But the irony is bitter: it arrived too late for the victims, and early enough to inspire the next generation of manipulators to learn to play by the rules. And at the same time, the market learned another silent lesson: financial elites rarely fall alone. This would echo decades later in the 2008 crisis, when entire banks broke the world and almost no one was imprisoned. And it still echoes today, in every corporate scandal, every discreet manipulation, every accounting error that hides billions. Mitchell was not just a character from 1929, he was the prototype of the modern executive, powerful enough to risk the system, protected enough to survive the fall. This is the true legacy of the man who could have been the ultimate villain of the story, but ended up being something even more disturbing: a reminder that broken systems don't punish individuals, they punish entire societies. And it is precisely at this point that our next step connects, because understanding Mitchell is understanding how future crises would be handled, justified, and repeated. His story doesn't end in 1929, it extends to today, influencing every crash, every bubble, and every government intervention that shapes the financial world. After being publicly held responsible for practices that helped inflate the speculative bubble and intensify the 1929 crash, Charles E. Mitchell seemed destined for oblivion. He declared personal bankruptcy in 1933, lost mansions, yachts, and works of art, and faced lawsuits that would have destroyed any other executive of the time. But, in a move that defies the moral logic of the financial system, Mitchell soon resurfaced. He was invited to lead the First National City Bank of Chicago, a respected and influential bank, far from being a small institution. There, he rebuilt his career, returned to navigating the halls of power, and reassumed the position of authority that so many believed he should never occupy again. On a personal level, Mitchell also found stability. Married since 1916 to Elizabeth Grant Mitchell, the couple had children and maintained an active social life even after the scandal. And, despite the public bankruptcy, he managed to rebuild a considerable part of his fortune. He didn't die poor, he died leaving an inheritance. In 1955, during a vacation in Italy, he suffered a heart attack and departed this world with the serenity of a man who, somehow, always landed on his feet. Thus, while thousands of families never recovered from the crisis he helped trigger, Mitchell ended his life as a respected executive, remembered not as a villain, but as just another name on the long list of men whom the system allowed to fall upwards.